There are films that a performer takes because the role is safe, because it confirms what the audience already knows about them, because it fits within the identity the industry has carefully constructed around their name and their image and their particular place in the public imagination. And then there are films that a performer takes for the opposite reason, because the role is nothing like anything they have done before, because the director sees something in them that the industry's current version of their identity has not accounted for. Because something in the material, even if the material is strange, even if it is demanding in ways that cannot be prepared for, even if the finished product will confuse people who thought they knew who this performer was, speaks to something real. Ann-Margret's decision to appear in Ken Russell's Tommy in 1974 was the second kind. And the scene that most fully tested that decision, the scene that asked more of her than anything the film's unusual, excessive, deliberately overwhelming world had prepared her for, began with a single note from the director, delivered quietly before the cameras rolled. What he said was brief. What it asked of her was not. Ann-Margret had spent her career up to that point as someone who performed from a specific kind of strength. Not arrogance. She was not an arrogant performer, but from the particular confidence of someone who had learned, through years of discipline and repetition, to bring the full force of her physical and emotional presence to a stage or a camera without reservation. It was what she was known for. It was, in a sense, what she was. The role of Nora Walker asked for something different. It asked for vulnerability not as a performance element, not as one of the colors in a performance, but as the primary register. It asked for the particular quality of someone who has reached the limits of what they can manage and has gone past them. Not dramatically, not with the emotional control of a performer who knows they are portraying loss, but with the specific messiness of someone who is actually losing. She had done difficult emotional work before. Carnal Knowledge, a few years earlier, had shown a range that surprised people who thought they knew what Ann-Margret was capable of. But what Russell was asking for in Tommy was different in kind, not just degree. He was asking her to occupy a kind of disintegration that was hard to enter from a position of control, and that could not be fully performed from the outside. She understood this. She also understood that she did not, at least initially, know exactly how to do it. By 1974, Ken Russell had established himself as one of the most discussed and divisive directors in British cinema, a filmmaker whose work was characterized by a specific kind of visual and emotional excess that his admirers called visionary and his critics called uncontrolled, but that no one who had seen it could describe as unintentional. He made films that were loud, overwhelming, demanding, and frequently uncomfortable. He was entirely aware of this. Tommy, the film adaptation of The Who's 1969 rock opera, was, in some ways, the perfect material for him. A story about a deaf, dumb, and blind boy who becomes a messianic figure through pinball, performed by one of the most important rock bands of the era, with a cast that included, alongside Ann-Margret, Elton John, Tina Turner, and Jack Nicholson. It was, by any measure, not a conventional film project. What Russell had seen in Ann-Margret, in her history as a performer, in the specific quality of energy and commitment she brought to everything she did, was something the project needed, and that none of the film's more obviously rock-world casting could provide. A center. Someone who could hold the emotional reality of the story against the deliberate unreality of everything surrounding it. Ann-Margret played Nora Walker, Tommy's mother, a role that required not the energy and physical confidence that her public identity was built on, but something more specific and more difficult. A portrait of a person coming apart. Not dramatically, not in the operatic mode that the rest of the film occupied, but genuinely, at a level below performance. Stop trying to make it beautiful. It was not an instruction about her technique. It was an observation about the thing that was preventing her from doing what the scene needed. The instinct built across a career of performing for audiences who needed to be held and engaged and given something generous to receive, to shape even the most difficult material into something that could be received, to manage the experience of watching her, even in extremis. In most of the contexts where Ann-Margret performed, that instinct was not a limitation. It was the skill. It was the thing that made a Las Vegas showroom work, that made an audience feel, even during the most demanding numbers, that they were in the presence of someone who was giving them something rather than exposing something. The management of the experience of watching her was, in most circumstances, exactly what was asked for. In this scene, it was the one thing that could not be allowed. Russell had seen it in the rehearsals. The technique was flawless, the commitment was genuine, and there was something else in the performance, something underneath the commitment that was shaping it, pulling it back slightly from the edge, making the disintegration look like a portrayal of disintegration rather than an occurrence of it. He was not criticizing her. He was identifying the thing that was in the way. Stop trying to make it beautiful. 4 words. And then he stepped away, and the cameras rolled. The scene that most demanded this from her was one of the film's most extreme sequences. A scene in which Nora Walker's controlled public life disintegrates entirely, in the specific, excessive, visually overwhelming mode that Russell had established as the film's language. It required her to surrender the management of her own presence that was, at this point in her career, almost instinctive. To allow the performance to go past the point where a performer typically pulls back. The morning the scene was scheduled, the crew had been setting up for several hours. The set was ready. The technical requirements had been addressed. Everything was in place for the cameras to roll. Ken Russell found Ann-Margret before the first take. Not in the public, crew-surrounding way of a director giving notes on a busy set, but quietly, briefly, in the few moments before the scene began, when everything is technically ready and the only remaining variable is what the performer is going to bring. What he said to her was not about the choreography. It was not about where to stand or how to move, or what the camera would be doing at any given moment. It was something more fundamental than any of those things, and it was brief. He said, "Stop trying to make it beautiful." Tommy was released in 1975 to an audience that was not sure what to make of it and has been arguing about it ever since. It was too excessive for people who came looking for a conventional film, too cinematic for people who came looking for a concert experience, too emotionally serious for people who came looking for spectacle, and too visually overwhelming for people who came looking for emotional seriousness. What it was, unambiguously, was one of the most unusual performances of Ann-Margret's career, the one that most clearly demonstrated the distance between what the industry's version of her allowed for and what she was actually capable of when the material and the direction gave her room to go somewhere the public version of Ann-Margret had not been. Ken Russell died in 2011. Ann-Margret spoke about him in the years after his death with with the warmth and precision she reserved for the people who had contributed something specific to her understanding of what she was doing. Not all directors she praised, many she praised, but Russell she credited in the specific, accurate way of someone accounting for what they received. One note, 4 words, and a scene that those who saw Tommy in 1975 and have thought about it since describe as one of the moments in that film that goes past what any of the film's considerable spectacle could produce. A person, briefly, actually falling apart rather than performing it. What she did in that scene became, in the years after Tommy was released, one of the most discussed elements of a film that generated a great deal of discussion. Critics who had written about Ann-Margret for years, who had praised her energy, her physicality, her command of a stage, wrote about this performance in terms they had not used for her before. Not because the performance was technically superior to what she had done in other films, though it was, but because it was doing something different, something that was less managed and more exposed, less the product of skill brought to bear on material, and more the product of skill getting out of its own way. Ann-Margret was nominated for an Academy Award for her work in Tommy. It was her second nomination. The first had come for Carnal Knowledge 4 years earlier, and it represented something about the way the industry was beginning to revise its understanding of what she was capable of. She has spoken about the scene in various interviews across the subsequent decades with the specific kind of directness she used for the things she considered genuinely significant. She described what Russell's note had done for her not as a creative liberation exactly. She had not been imprisoned. She had simply been managing something she hadn't needed to manage, but as a clarification, a small 4-word instruction that made the thing the scene needed suddenly legible. She credited him, not effusively, not in the way that performers sometimes credit directors as a social gesture, specifically, accurately, in the terms of someone who understood precisely what had been given and what it had made possible. There are directions that change a single scene, and there are directions that change the way a performer understands what they are doing, not just in that scene, but in everything that follows it. What Russell gave Ann-Margret before that scene in Tommy was both a 4-word note that addressed the specific thing in the way, gave her permission to remove it, and in doing so, opened something that the subsequent years of her career would continue to draw on. The understanding that the management of an audience's experience, the instinct to shape, to hold, to make even the most difficult material available to be received, was a skill that also had a cost, and that knowing when to put it down was its own, rarer, more difficult kind of skill. She had been performing for over a decade when she made Tommy. She would go on performing for decades more, in Las Vegas, on film, in roles that ranged across the full width of what she was capable of, in the work of someone who had learned, in various ways and from various sources, what performance actually required. One of those sources was a Tuesday morning on a film set in Britain, when a director she trusted walked up to her before the cameras rolled and gave her the only note she needed. Stop trying to make it beautiful. She did, and what happened next was